Founders Forum, Episode 5. Open your mind to a new episode of the Founders Forum, the podcast championing a free economy, sound assets, and blockchain solutions. Each week, your hosts, entrepreneur Cole Snell and economist Bob Murphy, interview pioneers and free thinkers to help you develop into the architect of your future. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Founders Forum. In this episode, we thought it might make sense to step back and just tell you, the listeners, a little bit about the backgrounds of your hosts, Cole Snell and Robert Murphy. So without further ado, here we are talking to each other. Hope you like it. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Founders Forum. We thought it would be appropriate at this stage to pause and maybe tell the viewers and listeners, depending on which medium you're using to absorb these podcast episodes, a little bit about the hosts of the show. So, Cole, welcome. I don't know, do you want to start the ball rolling or do you want me to start?
Sure. Let's start. I'll dive right in. Thanks, Bob. And it's great to be here, obviously, and thanks for listening. Just offline, it was actually funny. We were having this discourse before we started recording, and after we were talking, we were like, geez, we should have recorded that. So I'll just kind of dive into what we were talking about offline. The podcast is called Founders Forum. So there's two F's, Founders Forum, and it makes me think about another F word, which isn't the 4-letter variety. It's the FAILURE. It's the 7-letter variety. So I started thinking about failure and, what it is as a founder, to fail. And I was telling this story offline. I call it the Taleggio story. Taleggio is a type of cheese, and it's like Taleggio was the example. And every time I think of Taleggio now, I think of failure. It's really weird. I think of this washed rind Italian cheese and I think of failure. The long and the short of it is that I used to have a very successful cheese distribution company. I was in business with this extremely famous chef, and I used to supply him. And he had me VIP'd in all his restaurants. And I was 30 years old and I was just untouchable. I went from kind of rags to riches, overnight success. I was, again, selling artisanal cheese around North America. And one day I walked into this famous chef's business, one of his grocery stores, into his cheese counter. And there was this guy that was working there. And I saw this Taleggio in the counter that I did not sell, and I was exclusive to all of this chef's cheese. And I got home that afternoon and I sent this chef an email telling him, how dare you put this imposter Taleggio that you did not buy from me in your counter? And my ego and my arrogance, and this Taleggio was the result of my F word, my failure. Because he just sent me a quick email back saying, "You're banned. You're kicked out. That's not the behavior I expect from." I didn't just get kicked out of his grocery stores. I got kicked out of his restaurants. I got kicked out of his life. I wasn't allowed to move to the front of the line at his 5-star fancy restaurants in all these downtown urban centers. So yeah, every time I eat Taleggio, I have PTSD. But what a great lesson in failure.
That is interesting. So just to expand more broadly, so you're an entrepreneur and you've had several businesses, and that's one of the things that you're bringing to the table here as we interview either founders or people that we think can give practical tips to founders.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes our dynamics so interesting, is that we come to the same center from dramatically different places. We both have a passion for economics. I found my passion kind of for economics by stumbling into it, by trying to start businesses. I'm the furthest thing from a PhD and a doctorate in economics that one could get. I mean, everything I've learned has literally been through success and failure and learning it from the street. Whereas your success, and then later in life, I started to understand the value of mentorship, which I think we can get into. But then your success coming from a completely different background. I went from the street, and you come at it from a very academic, very institutional PhD perspective. And so, your background, maybe tell the listeners, where you got your PhD and kind of what led you to that and led you to being here today.
Well, sure. So yeah, when I I guess when I was in junior high at that level range, I thought I was going to go into physics. I read the books by Richard Feynman, if some of the listeners know who he is. And that's what I wanted to do. And that was I love the topic. My parents got the World Book Encyclopedia, and I would read the science section on special relativity at, late wee hours of the night and so forth. That's what I wanted to do. And then, but then I got, I guess, was it in high school? Yeah, I was in high school. I got into libertarianism. I started reading the works of what are called the Austrian economists, people like Mises and Murray Rothbard. And I realized, no, this is what I want to do. Like I have to. So by the time I was a senior in high school, I knew not only did I need to be an economist, but an Austrian economist. That I applied to that. I ended up going to Hillsdale College for my undergrad, which is, they have the library of Ludwig von Mises there. And for people who don't know, the Austrian school is just a particular school of thought. There's a Chicago school of Keynesian, it's the Austrians. And that's what captured my attention. And I went there, and then I went to NYU to get my PhD in economics. Again, there was an Austrian connection there. It was an Austrian fellowship. And I thought I was just going to be a college professor, doing research, writing books and whatever. And then I did get somewhat disillusioned in academia. So I went to Hillsdale College, was my first teaching position. And turned out the students weren't all like me. Like, I was kind of picturing, but I mean, I'm being a little bit glib with that, tongue in cheek, but there were just a lot of students that they were taking the classes because, oh yeah, I'm a business major and I got to do this. So there was that element that it was hard to get, fired up. And a lot of it too, I think, was because I was a younger professor. And I think probably had I just stayed there over time, I would have figured out ways to get the students more motivated and whatever. But it was tough in the beginning. I was having a tough time sort of like connecting with them. But then beyond that though, too, it was for the research, there'd be some area, like I just got disillusioned with the peer-reviewed, journals, scientific journal process, academic journal, I should say, that you'd work on something for a year, send it off to a journal. They would send it to a few referees. It might take, a year to finally get turned around or whatever. And so all said and done, the thing comes out, and then like 8 people might read it. And it's like that. Wow, that's a lot. And the other thing too was if it was anything innovative, you were necessarily criticizing like the existing people who were the authorities. And so if you're a journal editor and someone writes on some topic, who do you send it to referee as the authorities on that subject? And so of course they're going to say, no, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't understand. You know what I mean? So like it was kind of screwy, that whole process. And I think that's why a lot of academics now, they are more publishing their stuff online, just like you still, if you got to get tenure or whatever, you still go ahead and do the normal hoops. But a lot of the discourse is actually not happening through the peer-reviewed process because it's just so slow and fraught with, because crazy stuff gets published anyway. So it's not like the fact that some people peer-reviewed it means, oh, there's a really high standard of excellence too. So anyway, I ended up leaving academia. I went and worked for Arthur Laffer's firm in Nashville. And that's what got me to start being more like of a public figure in terms of like talking about economic stuff. Because up till then, it had been real theoretical. And the entrepreneur looks at the price structure and sees an opportunity. But we here just draw some, curves on the blackboard. And I would have been real hesitant to talk about, if someone said, is the stock market overvalued? I would have said, I can't answer that question. Go talk to, a speculator. And so I got over that fear. And the reason's not because I thought, actually, I'm more qualified than I thought before. It's that I saw all the other academics on TV and, pontificators, and I realized they don't know what they're talking about. And so it was more that, okay, well, the public's listening to these people, I might as well, go in with my caveats and try to give them something that I think is a little bit, I don't have a crystal ball, but these people are giving them a bunch of nonsense. So it's not going to hurt any if I go in and start trying to offer some. So that's what happened. And then I ended up, of course, people, if they go to the Founders Forum, they can see that Cole and I are part of Infinio. And it's probably appropriate for me to mention at this point, Cole, that I have noticed the stark difference when I'm working with people in the private sector. And I noticed this too when I was working at Arthur Laffer's firm. Like when you actually have customers who could take their business elsewhere, as opposed to just, students that, they could switch if the school gets a bit. But I mean, when you're working for a college, even if it's a private school, the pressure there, like the being a college professor is the cushiest job ever invented. And
Right.
so the rigor and like, oh no, you actually have deadlines and you got to deliver stuff, and it's fun to be working for an actual business that has to turn a profit.
Right. Like real world, hands-on, applying kind of what you learned in school, what you taught at school, and then now into the real world. One of the things that you said that was so interesting to me was kind of the idea of innovation. It was just kind of below the top of your introduction of yourself. There was something there about innovation. It reminded me of Graham Hancock and criticizing archaeology as science in a way. I mean, so I don't know. I've been like obsessed with this Graham Hancock. He's been like all over Joe Rogan. Well, he has the Netflix show about archaeology and criticizing archaeology for not being scientific. But I mean, he's kind of come at it out. Now his peers have the archaeology community has so heavily come down on him because he's been innovative and he's trying to put side economists kind of within the pillars of the economic doctrine or the college amongst your peers. It seems like innovation is stifled. Is that fair to say? And then do you have to get into the private sector, say, if you are an economist, or maybe there's some viewers that are interested in following? I mean, Dr. Murphy obviously is a big following. He's a public figure. People may say, hey, I want to be like Dr. Murphy when I grow up and be an economist. What advice would you give to that person? Stay at a university or go an entrepreneur?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So great questions. No, I'm not familiar with the Hancock guy. I'll have to check that out.
Fascinating Netflix series. He basically says that Egyptologists and their dating of, when the pyramids were built are crazy. And he's got all this scientific data to back it up. And he basically, says that civilization is like 10,000 years older than, he's this very controversial guy. So the community hate him because he's putting science forward.
Okay, yeah, no, I'll check that out. So yeah, what I would say, because I just real briefly before I talk about the main thing you asked me was, you hear stuff like that, and I think a lot of people just recoil and like, oh yeah, sure, this one cranky, okay, everybody else is wrong, and I can't be that glib that if someone does come forward and say, hey, our approach to treating disease is totally wrong, or the dating of the earth is totally off, or whatever the issue is, I will listen. Because in my own field, otherwise I'd be a hypocrite. Because in my own field, like what I'm telling the average person is, oh, all these guys that are coming out of MIT and University of Chicago and so forth, and they go and run the Federal Reserve. It's not just that they're a little bit off; like they're causing the business cycle, like by their very actions. In my view, like that's my theory of how the world works. So when the Federal Reserve chair gets up there and say, we're doing our best to fight inflation and to smooth out the business cycle, I was like, no, they're causing inflation and they cause the business cycle. So so if they could be that far off, in my view, when people come along and say, wow, the food pyramid that the FDA puts out or whatever, puts that thing out. Like, no, that not only is that a little bit off, like that makes Americans sick and that's totally wrong. And like I'm open to that because in my own field of expertise, I know that what the authorities say is completely wrong. So, but to your question, Jeff Dyson, I do the Human Action podcast with him. He's the president of the Mises Institute. We recently had an episode. We had Per Byland on, and we were talking about the state of economics. And then, at this point, it has been incredibly politicized, such that and it's not merely ideological, but like the way that the discipline has moved. If you go right now and get a PhD in economics at a top 20 program, you're mostly learning math. You could leave that program. I'll tell a real quick story. I don't think I've told on this podcast, where they were trying to unionize the TAs, the grad students at NYU when I was there. The UAW came in, the UAW, and try to unionize them. And so the administration didn't want that to happen for various reasons, obviously. And so I think it was like the provost or somebody was going around to all the departments saying, why are you guys so unhappy? So he's talking to us, the economics people, getting PhDs in economics from NYU. And he said, what do you guys want? And one guy says, yeah, we want housing. The Columbia students, uptown, they get housing subsidies. And so he said, okay, well, right now we give you a stipend. We just give you a pile of money. We can give you a break on housing, but then we have to give you less cash. Is that what you want? Because we were figuring just let you spend the money. And he went, well, no, because NYU owns the apartment buildings around here in Greenwich Village. And so it doesn't cost you anything to give us a break on the rent. And so you should give us both. And this is someone getting a PhD in economics saying there's no opportunity cost. And I could just see the provost is like, now I got to go talk to the film students. This is, oh my gosh. But the thing is, this guy in my program, I tell that story a lot, but it's because he was from Turkey. He was a whiz at math. He was one of our better students, like, that in the sense of going through the program because he was so technically sound at math, but he, had never read Henry Hazlitt or Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams probably in his life. So that's what I'm getting at is there's a lot of highly trained technical economists, but the field, what it rewards and what you need to do, to get tenure, you could get to that point and really not even know what a lot of us would think of as pretty basic common sense economic principles of, how does the free market work, or how does the market work, I should say. But in any event, yeah, there still is, if somebody just says, no, I love this stuff so much. And the idea, like I just, for the next 50 years of my life, I want to go and just teach an incoming crop of new students about, the problems with the minimum wage and, how do you figure out what the demand curve is and things like that. If that just excites you, then yeah, sure, go ahead and go into it. But I am saying that what I would say is for people who think, oh, I love like Austrian economics or libertarian political theory, so do I need to go get a PhD to help the cause? I would say no, you can go ahead and learn that stuff on your own. You don't need to go to some school somewhere to have a libertarian or Austrian college professor teach it to you. That's completely wasteful. You can learn it all just online, looking at lecture or even going to events too. You could see these people live and do whatever, and then go do some other job, something that excites you with your career. And then you can donate money to the cause like that. There's a role for that sort of thing too.
Yeah, that's really well said. And as mentioned, I come from a very different place than Bob does to meet in this center called Founders Forum. It was when I started to understand about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm 49 today. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to understand Austrian economics. And then I read a book, Bob's books primarily, and then I kind of got into some of the forefathers of Austrian economics that Bob mentioned. And then I started showing up in meetings. I was getting into the financial industry at the time. And the words that were coming out of my mouth were really interesting to people. Just in lunches, business lunches, or if I was recruiting people, or if I was trying to sell, say, a financial product to someone, it was that very basic cornerstone. I had about a thread of information that, Bob has an entire, tapestry of knowledge around Austrian economics, is, one of the world's leaders in the subject. But I had a thread of it. And just that thread alone allowed me to show up the way that I really desired to in business meetings, becoming more credible. And that, as a founder, credibility is as far as your business will or will not go. And it was those words, it was this understanding the basic foundation of Austrian economics that really truly allowed me to show up the way that I want. I guess my question would be, is that something that you find? Do you find that people are business owners that you've met that being able to build Austrian economics into, say, their language, or say is it like their skill set, if you will? Is it a beneficial thing?
Yes. And so I have no regrets that I went into the Austrian field, in terms of the school of thought that I chose. I thought these are the guys that really, are the closest to the truth of the existing schools of economic thought. And you're allowed to, it can be a buffet. There's insights I've grabbed from other places too, obviously. But in terms of, what the Austrian school, that's basic paradigm, I'm an adherent to it. And in particular, just their approach to entrepreneurship, like profit and loss and how that works. Because regular mainstream economists, basically, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but what they do is they come up with a model and then, quote, solve the model to find the equilibrium. And so they just look after all the hard work has been done, and they just show, oh, these are what the prices would be in this quantities and and this is what the system would look like when it's, in this balanced state, but they don't really talk much about, well, how does it get there? Whereas the Austrians focus more on the entrepreneur who sees this opportunity and then, resources here are undervalued and there's this potential. So if I bought low, I could sell high over here. And sometimes that involves a physical transformation of, inputs into a product. And that's the essence of, capitalism. And mainstream models kind of gloss over that because it's hard to model that transition period when things aren't in equilibrium? How do you model that? It's easy just to say, these are the conditions that would hold once everything has settled down. And that's kind of what they focus on. So the Austrians, just talking to regular business people, that resonates with them more. And then specifically their theory of what causes the business cycle. So as you know, Cole, I would go around, especially after, the quantitative easing started, giving presentations to crowds, teaching them what is Austrian business cycle theory, but I wouldn't even necessarily call it that. I would just say, hey, everyone, this is what I think happened with the housing bubble. I'd show charts and things like that. Here's what the Federal Reserve did under Greenspan. Look at what happened with home price index, blah, blah, blah. They started tightening. All of a sudden, things turn and crash. So if that story makes sense to you, well, then I'll look at what Bernanke's been doing, that kind of thing. So, I've had people come up to me afterwards and say, wow, I hated economics in college, but what you just said made sense, and so I do think that the Austrian approach to entrepreneurship and, again, the business cycle, central banking, that sort of thing, it resonates with a lot of people, not simply because, I hate the government, but It really makes sense that, kind of if they push interest rates down to artificially low levels, surely that has to screw something up. And maybe that has to do with these bubbles and, that sort of thing. So I definitely think there's traction there. And even in terms of, because for a period, once I left Hillsdale, I was trying, before I got hired by Laffer and went down to Nashville, I was trying to get into Wall Street, as a quant, because, again, I had that physics background and a lot of the equations or the math is the same. And in that realm, I noticed that they don't assume that the whole market is in total equilibrium. They just have what's called a no arbitrage condition. And so it's a much weaker thing. And so that it was easier as an Austrian economist to go into the math and the world of option pricing. Because there's a sense in which if people are buying and selling financial assets, things aren't in equilibrium. You know what I mean? Everyone doesn't have the same preference. If I'm selling a stock to you, it could be because I think it's overvalued and you think it's undervalued. And so it's kind of the way mainstream economists model things. It's kind of hard to capture financial market activity. And so the Austrian approach was a much better starting point for that, even for technical sort of academic-y papers.
Right. So we probably have two types of viewers, and we're not exactly sure who our viewers are yet for this podcast, and it's our 4th episode. So we may have the super geeked out.
I think we're up to episode 5 now.
Episode 5. Okay. So we're on episode 5. And we may have the really geeked out, Austrians that are tuning in because Bob has a big following. And we may have the people are searching for podcasts on founders and they're thinking, hey, I want to be a founder. I'm going to join in and see. So I definitely would recommend to anybody who's not from the Austrian school that's watching this is to kind of go back a little bit and write down a lot of the terminology that maybe Bob mentioned that you may not understand and Google it. Because I can promise you that it will serve you as a founder if you're raising capital, if you're trying to sell something or recruit somebody. I promise you, understanding what some of those terms meant, like the business cycle, for example, what is boom bust? Maybe you may understand in those terms. What happened in the housing bubble? So just to kind of stay on this vein, Bob, to give the person who doesn't understand, say, Austrian economics, as well as some who may, during, say, the housing bubble, there was one bank in particular, a bunch of banks, so one big bank, Lehman Brothers, that failed, but there was other banks that were bailed out. Now, if it was if we were running an Austrian economics, so I guess you could widely say that the economic model that the government enforces, so to speak, is more of a Keynesian model, so to speak, today. But if it was an Austrian model, what would happen, say, during that, as that business cycle was taking the bust end of the business cycle was taking its course, just so the viewer can have a holistic view of that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think I should first explain, why did the crisis come? And, depending how certainly by 2008, things were really getting bad. And the fall of 2008 is when, the crisis happened. That didn't just come out of nowhere. That wasn't because of unfettered greed, and it wasn't because of deregulation. That I would say the main culprit there was the Federal Reserve. And after the dot-com bust, people may remember in the late 90s, then Alan Greenspan's the head of the Fed. They brought down interest rates to very low levels, to 1%, held it there for a bit. And at the time, they were calling Greenspan the maestro because, we have a mild recession, but home prices didn't go down, right? That was they're praising him. And people, even Paul Krugman, people may know him, was sort of saying, what we need to do is have the Fed needs to replace the dot-com bubble with a housing bubble. And words that later would come back to haunt him, and he was saying, "Oh, I was just quoting someone else. I was just kidding." So there's that again, and just be real quick, but it's the Austrian view. Market prices serve a function. They communicate information. They allow people to coordinate their activities. So if the price is wrong, it leads to problems. And so when just the way we talk and say, "Oh, the Fed cut interest rates," well, how did it do that? It's not because they went out and saved a bunch of money, right? It's not that Greenspan was cutting lawns and saving up his allowance and then, "Here, let me lend this to people." And they were just creating money out of thin air, to use the phrase. And that's how the Fed pushed down interest rates, is just by pumping in newly created money that didn't correspond to anyone's genuine saving. So in the Austrian view, that's what causes this unsustainable boom, why housing prices in this particular example went up so much. But to answer your question, okay, given that the Fed did that and then they tightened, and then you can again see like the data all kind of fit together with this narrative I'm saying. And then it turns and there's housing prices start crashing. Then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are getting out. People were originally holding just for speculative purposes. Once they saw prices coming down, they tried to get out of it, and then prices crashed even harder. People who would, issue mortgage-backed securities now are in jeopardy and things like that. People are credit default swap issuers are in trouble, like AIG. So all that stuff's coming to a head. So what we were told in the fall of 2008 was, well, we need massive intervention. We need the Treasury to come in and to take over banks, basically, to inject equity. We need the Federal Reserve to be a backstop to start buying up these so-called toxic assets, or else, your ATM's not going to work next Tuesday, that sort of thing. So David Stockman, I think, did a great job in his book going through and just explaining the mistakes of that. Like, no, that's fallacy. Like life insurance, AIG, for example, its life insurance business was completely segregated. They had their reserves that were, distinct. So if AIG's speculative stuff collapsed, it's not that your life insurance policy would be underfunded, things like that. ATMs still would have worked, blah, 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 right? But what would have happened is the big hedge funds and other, institutions, investment banks that aggressively profited on the way up would have gone bust. And yeah, it would have been painful, but look at how painful it was, that whole, we had like a lost decade basically. And look at how much debt we racked up and the Fed's balance sheet swollen. So yeah, it would have been bad, but that would have hit rock bottom. Resources would have been reallocated. So when there's a financial crisis and then you just let things find their natural bottom, it's not that farmland disappears. It's not that all the computer programmers would forget, how to program, right? Brain surgeons are still there, right? None of the physical buildings disappear. It's in the sense, it's all just changing property titles when in bankruptcy, restructuring. So it would have been bad temporarily, but then, like I said, they would have found bottom. And then the lesson learned would have been, okay, so the next time there's a speculative mania, be more conservative, because look at all these household names that went under last time. Whereas what did happen now in practice was people learned the lesson. You might as well profit and leverage on the way up, because if things get really bad, don't worry, the Fed and the Treasury will come in and bail everybody out. So you would be stupid to leave money on the sideline on the way up, because you don't want to be caught with your pants down, because no, they'll come in and, give you suspenders.
So yeah, when I first started, that was really well described. To kind of say it in a slightly different way from, someone coming from the street as a founder looking at this, it was when I came into Austrian economics and started to understand it and how it kind of really applied to my life. I talked about failure, 7-letter word failure, and I was upset at the guy that was buying this Tellagio from somebody else. And so he kicked me out. I was no longer, I was kind of corrected. You see these big corrections happen. I was corrected out of his business. And it kind of made, because I did something foolish, essentially. I shouldn't have sent him that email. I should have slept on that email. It's great advice I can give to all founders is, if you're emotional, write the email, don't hit send, sleep on it, and think if you still want to send it in the morning, then send it, but at least give yourself 24 hours. I should have given myself 24 hours. I sent the email. I got corrected out of his market, and it paved the way for not just one new supplier, but a series of new suppliers, and it created a healthy competition in this person's market. So it's really no different. It was surprising to me when I heard that there was an option to not bail out these companies. And I started thinking, well, originally I was like, well, that'd be a really terrible thing. These poor banks and these poor auto manufacturers, they should be bailed out. These people need, but then I started thinking, well, they're possibly poorly managed. They had poorly managed balance sheets. They're not solvent companies. Why would you throw good after bad, as it were? And it was people like you and reading your books that just simply explained to me, let the correction happen, get rid of them, and let's learn from those mistakes and let the second or third or fourth generation of people filling that gap move forward and prosper. Kind of unadulterated capitalism to some degree. And it just really kind of opened my eyes to...
It's to stress, it's the profit and loss system, right?
Yeah.
If capitalism were just profits all the time and no one ever suffered losses, people aren't taking enough risks, right? In a healthy economy, there should be businesses that fail. If that never happened, like in the Soviet Union, businesses didn't fail because everything was centrally planned. And so, people would get up and they'd go to work every day at a certain thing where they were ordered to go, and they would have inputs coming in and stuff coming out, even if nobody wanted it. But hey, we're just going to keep doing it because that's what the central plan says. And that's actually, that's not healthy. That's not what you want. That it's in order to marry, satisfying the consumer, having stuff being made that makes sense in some measurement or some according to some criteria, and freedom of choice, like people get to work where they want. There have to be business failures. People have to get laid off occasionally. If something changes and it no longer makes economic sense for workers to go to this particular factory and be taking steel and other valuable, scarce resources and making products, because there's a better way humans have found to do that. The only way that can happen is they need to get laid off. That's how they know, I got to go work somewhere else now, right? And it's unfortunate, but again, the alternative to that kind of model is just, some people just order everybody where to go. Yeah, like you're saying, it's with the auto manufacturers and things. Bankruptcy is a thing. Like that happens all the time. And it's not that the factories typically get burned to the ground or even like physically pulled apart. If it made sense that, those workers should still keep going there, then new ownership could come in and take it over. If it doesn't make sense, then, that's a sign that, we found a better way to make cars. And that's unfortunate for the particular individuals in that instance. But when you go to the store and everything is cheaper because of that innovation happening in every other sector, that's where you see the benefits. So it's like what would be best for any individual is every other sector innovates and it's cutthroat competition, except mine. In mine, the thing that I do in my job is where I don't want competition. But obviously that's not a sustainable, what system that where the rules apply to everybody makes the most sense is we allow competition. Somebody comes up with a better way to make this product, let them do it, and then we all benefit from that. The competitors in that one sector, yes, they temporarily are hurt, but they benefit in their role as taking advantage of all the other sectors where that innovation is happening all the time too.
Yeah, one of the things when you're speaking that way, one of the things that comes up for me, we do business all over the world. You take these two neighboring countries like Canada and the United States, and I couldn't think of two more drastically different perspectives, say, on winning or losing, profits or losses, success, failure, from an economic perspective, from a business perspective, from an innovation perspective. So I cut my teeth in Canada, and now I primarily do business in the United States. And in a lot of ways, I'm really glad that I did it that way. As much as when I'm speaking to younger Canadian founders or entrepreneurs, I'm constantly reminding them to be more American. Be more like our friends to the South, because Americans are more forgiving. I would say, generally speaking, and I'm broad stroking here, but for the most part, Americans are more forgiving of failure. And they go, well, how do you? I said, well, let's take, like a guy like Donald Trump, for example. I mean, how many, like Donald Trump declaring bankruptcy is like a meme. Like, I don't know how many times I don't know if he's ever declared bankruptcy, but it seemed like for a certain period of time in the 90s and the early 2000s, he was declaring bankruptcy in the news like every 5 years or more or something. But yet, you turn around and he's running for president at the same time. And people are just forgiving. And I would say, to use this kind of gross analogy of the whole thing. I mean, that's the one piece of kind of advice that I would give to founders fairly consistently is, I think it was Winston Churchill that said, definition of success is moving from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And just throwing it against the wall and trying. But yet now in Canada, actually declaring bankruptcy is sign. I had a guy call me the other day. He was having a hard time in business, and he thought, well, maybe one of my options is, he was kind of down and out. He said, well, maybe one of my options is bankruptcy. And this was a Canadian. It's a slightly different story in the United States, not completely different, but it's more nuanced. And again, it's a more forgiving insolvency system in the United States than it is in Canada. But I say to Canadians all the time, I mean, if that should be an absolutely last resort, rock bottom solution, because climbing out of that hole for Canadians in business there's so many things you can do, and solutions and negotiations and communications, that you can have with whether it's trustees if it gets to that point, or banks, or creditors, or whoever it is. But there's a lot of reason, I would say, to not fear insolvency or bankruptcy and talk about opportunity cost. I mean, if that's the thing, and I think it does do that to Canadians for the most part. I think it holds Canadians back. Never mind Canadians, the taxes that they have to pay. It's a whole other story. But even in America, the taxes are significant. But I mean, there are strategies today for founders, again, through research and through listening to podcasts like this, to hedge their business globally, getting your money structured in the appropriate way so that tax is mitigated is important. It's almost like the IRS and the CRA and tax collectors around the world kind of have drawn a line in the sand, and they said, let's play a game. It's you against us. We're going to try and collect as much, but you have a responsibility as a business owner to pay in the daylight as little as you can. So the question is, what is the value of a great accountant? Or, what is the value of researching taxes, and instead of putting the energy into being curmudgeonous and resentful about it, spending the time and the energy to figure out how to play the game with the CRA and control your business. I mean, Warren Buffett said it best. Actually, Bill Ackman, Pershing Square, once one of the biggest hedge funds in the world. I saw a TikTok video of him yesterday saying that the best thing that you could do as an investor or a business person is basically read and watch everything that Warren Buffett, has ever done. And Warren Buffett will basically say one thing. He has learned to read the books of a business. He has learned how to understand a balance sheet inside and out. And he has become addicted to learning about businesses and making good investments by reading balance sheets. And again, you don't have to be an accountant to be able to read a balance sheet. So, that's all stuff for me that I didn't start doing until I was probably in my 40s. Up until that point in time, I was getting by as a founder just on being innovative, being creative, being passionate. But your leash is only so long. And eventually you're going to be sitting down in a boardroom, and you're going to be able to expect to speak to a balance sheet, or you're going to be able to expect. Robert Kiyosaki says the same thing. He said the fundamental definition of a successful entrepreneur is your ability to raise money, period. And you can only raise money on the backs of a solid foundation. And what does a solid foundation of a business look like? It does not look like a good idea. It does not look like a solution to a problem. It looks to the people that matter, like a cap table and a org chart and data room, good books, audited financials, a good relationship with your bank, a good law firm, a good accounting firm. This is what matters to the people that matter in the success of your business.
Well said. And yeah, I just would encourage the listeners, I guess, for that subset that are maybe working at a regular job, 9 to 5 as a sort of a salaried employee, but they have a dream of starting a business. And that's one of the things we're going to try to do in this podcast, is to elaborate on all those issues that Cole just listed, because it's not enough to have an idea for a better mousetrap, but you got to convince some people to fund the project, among other things. So we look forward to sharing those insights and bringing interesting guests on to help share that wisdom and to allow people to thrive. Because I think you probably agree with this, Cole, that it's going to be people in the private sector creating solutions that it's going to help us dig out of this mess that we're in.
Totally agree. I mean, you guys watching this are the lifeblood of economy. We need you. The world needs you to swing for the fences, try and hit home runs, entrepreneur. It's vitally important today that the only way to get out of this mess is by smaller government. Let's kind of bring it back to that. We need more people out there not wanting to go get jobs, but go and create things. And I think that's happening. I'm an optimist. I live in the world of glass half full. I think we're going to be, just fine. And I think there's more and more. I mean, whether it's going to be done through entrepreneurships or robots running the world and artificial intelligence, either way, I feel like we're somehow going to win. But I'm only going to be around for maybe another 40 years. So, I mean, easy for me to say.
But even there, AI is listening and training themselves on what we give the content. There's going to be some good principles. So as you replicate and try to start new businesses to make more robots, then these principles are timeless.
Totally timeless. Thanks, Bob. That was a good conversation. I hope you all gained a lot of insight into who Bob and I are. This was a podcast for you to meet us a little bit. If you have any questions for us, obviously, you know how to reach out to us in the show notes, or you can DM us directly. Be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are.
This concludes another episode of the Founders Forum. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the hosts and for previous episodes, visit foundersforum.io. Thanks for listening.